Elegy for My Father, Part 6. David Paul LaMontagne, my father, was born on the 13th day of September in 1930. I talked earlier about how Dad's mom and father divorced when he was a small boy, and how he was shared from relative to relative, as well as spent a small amount of time in a home, and how determined he was to make a stable family life for himself, for whoever he would choose as a wife, for whatever children he would father. This was important to him, and a thing he was determined to do. However, when he actually got to the point of being a father, and especially a father of 3 boys, he found himself handicapped by not having been raised in a family, and thus not having all kinds of automatic examples of how to handle things and what to do about them. He was continually distressed when us 3 boys fought with one another. He had no understanding of how that could be. He'd experienced a childhood short in friends and playmates, and had always dreamed that if he had a brother, he would have had someone to play with and do things with all along, and could not imagine having a brother and then spending so much time fighting with him. My mother grew up with an older brother, and they fought some, and so she understood it, and that it was not as serious or as much of a problem as Dad seemed to think, but Dad had a hard time with it. It made him angry. He had a hard time with anger as a young man. Certainly, he had stuff in his childhood that were the ingredients of a fairly ordinary anger. His mother had been the kind of person who has a real sharp tongue and expects perfection from people as the minimum acceptable behavior, and always finds fault with every possible failing or fault in anyone else. Dad inherited that in part, but it also led him to get angry from time to time. It was a difficult thing for him to control. He did a certain amount of yelling and screaming, much more of it than my brothers and I and my mother thought was necessary, except for standard classic punishment spankings, which in those days was a perfectly normal way to raise children. Maybe it was not the best way to do it, and we have mostly quit doing it since, but at least in those days it was relatively ordinary, so a person didn't have to be wicked or vicious or vile to want to spank their children. It took a while for us as a society to learn that its good was mixed with some harm, and to start trying to give it up. But except for standard classic spankings, I never saw Dad hit anybody. But he certainly broke a few things and did a lot of yelling, especially when he was under stress or when he was afraid. If someone got hurt, he would get angry about it, almost certainly because it made him afraid. When he was not in control, and in our early years, money was tight, and he did not feel like he was in control of our fate, our welfare, our relative position of wealth, at least in terms of having a roof, clothes, and food. When he felt like he was not in control, he would get angry. This meant that during the years we lived in Corvallis, that once a month when the bills were settled, there would be an angry day, and it would be very hard on my mother. So Dad went along and from time to time admitted that he felt lost about how to raise children because of not having had an example, but he kept working at doing the best he could. Dad was probably, in some sense, a classic Jeffersonian egalitarian. He believed that we had something important in this country in the way of personal and individual freedom that was rare in the history of the world and that was incredibly valuable, and he valued it a lot, even if he thought that most of the people most of the time did mostly stupid stuff with their freedom. He still believed that they were entitled to that. He tried to raise his sons the same way, in the belief that freedom and independence ultimately were perhaps the most important thing about their relationship with the society and the world around them. And though he tried to teach what was good and what was right and to enforce it, he was slightly more in favor of personal freedom than he was of enforcing goodness. He never explored this philosophically. He didn't talk politics other than to complain about stupidities and foolishnesses in politics. He didn't talk much about political theory, but his practice and his behavior and the way he dealt with us over and over and over again was to help us to be free and independent persons as much as possible. And he usually started trusting us with significant freedom about the time we were 15 or 16. I remember the first time he ever let me take the car out myself in an evening when I was going out to do stuff with friends. He didn't wait up to see when I got home. I explained that I was going to get home at about 11. I actually got home about 11:15. It was no big deal because he went to bed at his usual 9, 9:30, 10 o'clock at the latest and didn't even worry about it. He did that a lot once we got to an age where he could. And he kept reactions on as light a level as he could sometimes. I once called him and said that I've been going off on a day trip to the Western Shore in Maryland, and had stumbled next to a breakwater and fallen against it and cut my knee open for about 5 stitches worth. So my friends who had the car that was being driven for us took me to the nearest hospital, and I had to call my father and ask him for the insurance information for the sake of the hospital. And I told him what had happened, and I split my knee open. They wanted to put stitches in it. He gave me the information, and I handed it over to the hospital. And he didn't get upset. He didn't demand that I come right home. I went back out and spent the rest of the day on the beach with my friends, although I had to stay out of the ocean to keep the wound clean. When we were younger, I can't imagine him doing such a thing, but by the time us boys were 15 or 16, he was treating us like that. He was conscious, I'm sure, of his anger, and that it was improper, and that it was not what he wanted to do. It was not how he wanted to behave. It one day happened, when I was 15 or 16, that I had done something stupid or foolish or wrong. I don't know, I had no great moral failings in those days, so it was probably something stupid or foolish. Maybe I'd got my glasses broken again. I broke my glasses at least a dozen times during the 4 years of high school, usually playing sports carelessly and costing Dad money he didn't have to spare, and usually getting him angry every time. So maybe it was that, I just don't remember. But there was an evening when I'd done something foolish or wrong or stupid, and I was in my room waiting, and my mother was upset because she knew she was going to have to tell Dad when Dad got home from work. And Dad did not like being blasted with stuff when he got home from work, but sometimes it couldn't be avoided. And I knew that when he got home, and my mother knew that when he got home, the roof was going to be raised. And I heard him arrive, and I heard him come in down below, and it was quiet and calm for a little while. And then I heard voices and the sound of Dad coming up the stairs. So I went to the door of my room and stepped out into the upstairs hallway so as to be right there and meet him when he came to yell at me. Because one of the things I'd learned over the years, that the best way to handle Dad when he was angry like that was to stand up and look him square in the eye and say, "Yes, sir," "No, sir," and "I'm sorry, sir," and "It won't happen again," or stuff like that. It was the best way to handle it when he was angry or upset. And I was reasonably skilled at that. My brother Gene was not reasonably skilled at that. He would react against it, and he would be as angry at Dad as Dad was at him, and he would show it sometimes. This caused my father to usually presume that my brother Gene was in the wrong more often than he actually was. It was just a bad thing about how they fit together. Later on, they got along much better, but during those years growing up, that was a problem. So I came out onto the landing, the second floor hallway, out of my room to meet Dad when he came up to yell at me. And as he came around the corner of the stairs and up the hallway towards me, I saw him get a grip on himself. And he stopped himself right in front of me, in the usual position from which he would start yelling at me. And he stopped himself. And he turned away, and he went back downstairs. And on that occasion at least, and on much fewer occasions in the future, he didn't yell at me. He began to stop getting angry and yelling at us when he could help himself. Which wasn't always, but it was a significant improvement. When he turned around and went back downstairs without saying anything to me and without yelling at me, I went back into my room and I cried for a while. It was one of the few times I ever cried about some interaction I had with my father. So my father believed that the freedom and independence of his sons was a very important thing, and he tried to honor it as best he could. And when I came home from my freshman year at college, having become a Christian, he was very unhappy about that. He believed that Christianity and most religions were probably nonsense. He was less certain about the existence of God and always called himself an agnostic, not an atheist. But at least organized religion, he was pretty sure, was a load of crap. And the crap was piled on frequently by the officials and ministers of religions, and mostly to enhance their own position. So Dad was by no means happy when I became a Christian. But even though he was clearly unhappy, clearly holding back anger, he said not a word against it. In fact, along about my birthday, which comes just 3 or 4 weeks after coming home for the summer every year, along about my birthday, he bought a copy of the biggest, heaviest, thickest Bible he could find, which was this one, right here. An English translation of the Jerusalem Bible being a very famous French translation of the Bible, a French Catholic translation, which was full of articles and notes and footnotes and explanations, as well as the text of the Scripture. He brought that home and he dropped it in front of me at the dining room table, and he said, "Well," he said, "if you're going to do this thing, you'd better do a good job of it. So I expect you to read this." And so I did. I spent the rest of the summer and read the thing all the way through. The importance here is that even when I was doing something that he disapproved of and didn't like, since it wasn't morally reprehensible or dangerous, other than in the classic religious sense, he decided that my freedom to choose here was more important than his dislike of what I had chosen. And so he grudgingly and in a minor way supported it. He tried to be like that with everyone he could. When later I became a minister long years later, he showed up for my ordination ceremony, quite by surprise. Mom and Dad showed up and were there at the church greeting, and I almost didn't recognize that it was him and Mom in the rush of greeting people, all the people there were to be greeted. But he showed up for that ordination ceremony, and then he showed up again later with Mom for when I graduated with my PhD from Princeton Seminary. And in the last years of his life, the last 15 or so, he was interested often in some of the sermons I was preaching. I wouldn't expose him to my ordinary everyday garden variety sermons, but there were 1 to 2 dozen sermons over the course of 7 to 10 years preaching that I thought relatively highly of, and these I shared with Dad, and he was, in some part, impressed by them too. Impressed enough not to believe or change his belief system, but to at least come to a more comfortable place of accepting that at least I hadn't done anything really stupid, and that I was doing productive and important work in the field I'd chosen for myself, even if it was not a field he would ever have chosen and was doing a thing he didn't actually believe in. This is part of why I also tend to think that freedom and independence are the most important things, and goodness is really important and really close to them, but not quite the same, because without freedom and independence, goodness is just another form of what you're forced to do by your society around you. Unless goodness is chosen with a certain amount of freedom and self-intention, it's not quite as good as it should be. So I tend to have picked that attitude up from my father. I have carried it with me. I've given it a more philosophical expression over the years than he ever did, but I got it from him. And he practiced it even when it hurt him to practice it. And that's one of the things I remember about him and love most deeply about him.